history.
Talking about lack of deference and how it's not surprising today when Lady Di appears on the Daily Express, but in those days, put it back in those times.
Well, the whole sort of political discourse was very much limited to propertied elite, and this was a cultural limitation as well as an economic and political one, that there were these gates of entry. You had to have classics, you had to be able to quote from Virgil or Ovid, or perhaps more from the historical writers of ancient Rome. And the very idea of Tom Paine, who was a staymaker's apprentice and then not a customs officer, but I think of an excise officer, an ordinary person presuming to take opinions on high political questions, was ludicrous and ruled him out of account straight away. And he wasn't to be ruled out of account, and he managed to get through to a large section of the population despite his disqualification in this sense. So there is this traditional deference and reverence which the people have become habituated to, and one man alone managed to break that down in the Rights of Man, and I think it was an amazing achievement, and it was never put together again. Paine continued to be a central text of radical and reform movements until the second half of the 19th century. And beyond, for some people, yes.
You said that, the quote that I love in your book is that it's, along with, I think, Pilgrim's Progress, it's the people had it in their back pocket.
Yeah.
You could say that. But that Paine in the 19th century, talk a bit about that.
Well, I said that there was a heavy repression of reformers at in the later 1790s. And this, together with the fact that we were at war with revolutionary France, made reform seem itself treasonable. So that there was some isolation of reformers, but they were there still, and their cheap editions of Tom Paine would be in their back pockets. And they would hold discussion meetings and so on. And what happened was that, if you like, the intellectuals of the working class were Paineite, Tom Paineite. And when the Combination Acts were passed, which limited trade union activity and rights even further than they had been at the very end of the century, the unions went underground, and the leaders of these underground unions tended to be Tom Paineites, so they became extremely influential in the early working class movement in this way. I mean, if you force something underground, it gets very tough and resistant, and that's what happened with Tom Paine. Then, at the end of the French Wars, 1815, when reform activity became more possible again, one of the forms that it took would be great dinners at which the reformers would meet, and they would have successions of toasts to their heroes. And Tom Paine was always number one or number two of these toasts to the immortal memory of the great Tom Paine. And they were very protective of Paine, the Tom Paine supporters. There's a nice story about someone, I think this is in later years, in Chartist years, who had a meeting referred somewhat contemptuously to Tom Paine. And one of Tom Paine's zealous supporters stood up and said, "Mr. Thomas Paine, if you please." He had to be treated with proper respect and deference, yes. So I think it was a leading text for the Chartists, the Rights of Man. You can name a number of the founders of the Chartist movement who were Paine supporters. And I think this continued with the free thinkers, of course, in the case of the Age of Reason. This continued until the time of Bradlaugh, who was a great free thinker of the 1870s.
In a sense, he wouldn't stay dead.
No. And there is an extraordinary sense that some of his very simple, basic ideas of democracy have come alive again. And it's difficult to see anyone who represents as directly the new mood of democratic rights that's sweeping the world than Tom Paine.
Why isn't he in the history books? Why do we see 2 lines of him in an American history book, maybe no line in a French history book, and I don't know about the British history book?
That would require some research to find out why he has not honoured, as one might expect, by historians in various countries. I think one reason is that in Britain he did offend that very powerful segment of opinion, the nonconformist conscience. They never came to terms with Paine. And in another sense, history, until late years, has always been strongly class-biased. And Tom Paine was on the wrong side in the class war. It's true that he never became an object of academic respect in the sense that Burke, and there have been endless learned academic treatises written about Burke and his reflections, which Tom Paine's Rights of Man was in answer to. And Burke is treated very solemnly as a major philosophical mind, whereas I think he is pretty confused and haphazard mind myself. But Paine has been given none of this attention. But as I say, your question why, the question why, is not easy to answer. I'll have to do quite a lot of research to find out.
We live in an age of all-powerful states. Paine regarded government almost as a necessary evil.
Yeah.
What is the... he seems to be embraced by both the left and the right.
Yes. Yes, I think this radical Whiggism, which Paine is an inheritor of, is a breaking apart into 2 halves of the Whig liberal tradition, which stems from Locke, if not before. And Tom Paine tends to be on the anarchist half. That is, he considered, which I think is an excellent precept, that strong government was a bad thing. Everyone assumes that strong government must be a good thing. Weak government, he says, the business, if you took away what today we would call the state, that is, if you took away the House of Lords, the monarchy, the privileged classes, if you took them away, the business of life would still go on, the business of society would go on probably more successfully than before. If you were to do away with the landed gentry, the great landed aristocrats, the land would still be ploughed and sown and the crops be reaped because they do nothing to contribute to that at all. All they do is take the rent. And I think this very simple view, which is close to that of a sort of modified anarchism, that is that the country conducts its own affairs through its own local and regional institutions and doesn't require a heavy and expensive state apparatus. That, I think, is Paine's position.
And here you have in England local governments being abolished and even a more central government in Brussels being applied.
Yes, I think this is contrary to the trend of things, but I think there is a resistance to the centralization of the state today.
Here's a quote, 1982 Daily Telegraph, when they saw a film about Paine. Among decent Englishmen in his time, his name was synonymous for treachery, blasphemy, and debauchery. And I'm not talking about 1882 or 1782, this is 1982. Paine today seems to, in England, how is he understood and his role in the American and other democratic revolutions?
Well, I think with people who have some historical understanding, he's got a pretty good name now, but I wouldn't say he was a great popular figure. I don't think the ordinary school kid is told enough about him for him to be that. The very conservative town of Thetford in East Anglia, where he came from, where he was born, now has a statue to him and a very fine collection of his books in the library. So that there's slow recognition gathering way. It's a very conservative town, and I think this is interesting.
Of course, there was opposition when that statue was put up.
Yes.
The Tory council member called him an unmitigated scamp.
Perhaps I shouldn't. Perhaps it's unfair to Thetford to call it so conservative. It has had a radical mayor recently, and there are signs of change.
Pain on human rights, we take it for granted these days that humans have rights. Talk about that.
Yes, human rights are very much part of the language of politics internationally, even in China nowadays. And yet, if you ask what are the intellectual inheritance, where does the theory of human rights base itself? It, of course, bases itself on very many sources, but the clearest source of all is Tom Paine, and that, I think, is terribly important, very significant. His claim for human rights was for all men, including slaves. There wasn't any hedging of it at all. He didn't have any sort of property qualification for electors. He did have a masculine definition of what a human was. It was left to Mary Wollstonecraft to write the Rights of Woman, which didn't take over the whole program and platform of Paine, but took over some of it. And it was also for the demystification of government. And that's one reason that he wrote The Age of Reason, is that for Paine and for others of his generation, priestcraft and kingcraft went together. That priestcraft was seen as a means of upholding the mysteries which were upholding monarchy as well. And so he thought the attainment of human rights required the demystification of the vocabulary and the institutions of the ancien régime, or the old regime in England.
I'd like to ask you a personal question. In your work on the history of the British working class, were you excited? Did you discover Paine? Had you always known about him? Were some reading his things did it excite you?
I'd always known something about Paine, but I discovered more when I wrote The Making of the English Working Class. Particularly interesting and exciting was the tremendous response to this short book, the second part of The Rights of Man, amongst working people, artisans and shopkeepers and Sheffield cutlers and Norwich weavers and such like.
And this was a new information for you.
Oh yes, I mean it's very, very exciting to look at the papers in the Public Record Office and see the alarmed, terrified sometimes reports from magistrates and spies as to the appalling and sensationally unconstitutional language which these people are using, and the revolutionary fears that this aroused in the ruling class.
So you were sitting in the library reading it.
Oh yeah. Yes, there's loads of them, yes.
Do you remember any, not by heart, but the text or what the gist of some of them were?
Well, the magistrate would write in and say that every collier was going to work with the rights of man in his pocket, and these people had lost all deference and respect, and were meeting together and plotting. The magistrate would suppose plotting the overthrow of the government.
Do you believe in democracy?
Very much, yes, I do. I believe in democracy very much. I don't think of this purely in terms of institutional arrangements, but I think the notion of citoyen, of every fellow human as a citizen, that is, not only as a man, but also as someone carrying duties and rights of citizenship is terribly important. An active sense of democracy, and I think an active sense of democracy is what's lacking in this country today. I think it really has, I think some of the ideas, even of medieval time, of people taking a turn with various kinds of job, of the constable of the parish going in rotation around the farms, the idea of a jury system in which 12 people, any people, at random, just 12 people would have the right to sit as a jury and judge their fellows, could never have been invented in the 20th century. It would have been, the experts would have all found it absolutely outrageous, ludicrous, laughable idea. And I think that we have lost a lot of the democratic input that we have earlier in our history.
Do you think that individuals in the 20th century can affect change? And could a Tom Paine pop up and write a pamphlet that would topple?
I don't know. I don't know whether this could change or not. I'm quite pessimistic sometimes. There seems to be such power and influence in sections of the media that always overwhelmingly seem to have a majority of the actual ballots behind them. But it's a great mistake to think that the tradition is dead. I mean, it is still alive, albeit as a minority tradition. Okay.
Right. Just one last, because
Five. That's good.
6. And go. That's perfect. Great.
Thank you. Diantha, we're recording.
Room tone for
One
EP
moment.
Thompson
We're recording
interview.
room tone.